Well, Congressman Huelskamp, thanks for taking the time to meet with me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure to join you today.
And I have to get a housekeeping thing out of the way. I was formerly your communications director.
Yeah, we still argue, but we all pretty well agree you did a pretty good job. At the end of the day, I mean, that's what we like to see as folks, that conservatives moving in and off the Hill and making a difference in a lot of places in Washington, D.C.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Well, let's get right to it. I guess the big question is, do House conservatives trust Speaker Boehner?
I think it's the old Reagan adage, trust but verify. There have been ongoing retribution against those who have voted their constituents and voted their principles, and there's a lot of fear amongst folks in both conservatives and otherwise. But at the end of the day, I represent, for example, 700,000 Kansans. I've told the Speaker I don't work for him, but I tell you, there's this ever-growing divide between Washington, D.C. and the rest of America, and conservative principled legislators sitting on that divide and trying to make certain that Washington listens. And it is frustrating when Republicans who claim to be the party of conservatives attack conservative principles.
And let's talk about that, because Speaker Boehner took positions away after the trade votes. Has that relationship between Speaker Boehner and conservatives changed? Has it gotten progressively worse?
I think it has gotten worse. I think that actually is a sign of poor leadership. Leaders should bring people together. For years now, Republicans have pointed out, rightly so, that Obama as the president has been a divider. Now we have the same thing going on Republican leadership, dividing up folks, But at the end of the day, and if you look particularly at the polls where you see 2/3 of Republicans don't trust Republicans in Washington, and frankly, I agree. They don't trust the leadership in this town. They don't trust the establishment because they're not doing what they said we do, which is fight for conservative principles. Fighting doesn't mean actually winning, but actually having game plan that says we're going to fight for what we believe in. That's what we expect, and there's just this ever-growing frustration, particularly with the leadership, that there's an establishment in Washington that just doesn't listen.
Well, let's talk about that, because obviously Supreme Court had some major rulings. You have the Burwell case, you have same-sex marriage. Where does that leave the priorities of Congress after those big decisions?
Well, those big decisions, I think we've seen just basically a lot of silence. I mean, key issues for values voters, which are tens and millions, perhaps hundreds of millions. Actually, 50 million Americans voted to support traditional marriage. And so far, it looks like there'll be no response from Congress to a very narrow decision. It wasn't like it was 9-0 or 7-2. It was 5-4. There's still a chance to continue to move the dial and say, hey, there are people out there we need to protect. Now we're going to try to move a First Amendment Freedom Act, which would protect the men and women who hold the position, as has been the position in this country for centuries, that marriage is between a man and a woman. But we have no promises from leadership they want to even run that. We should run a resolution of disapproval, at least send a message that we don't think that decision needs to be made by 5 unelected lawyers with lifetime tenures. So, and again, that's a great example where the establishment in Washington looks around and says, well, doesn't anybody care about it? Well, if they were listening to the hundreds of millions of Americans frustrated with Washington, then they say, hey, we need to do something on that issue like so many others.
So where do those decisions, the Burwell case, same-sex marriage, where do you think it's going to take our country in the future?
I think it takes more and more centralization, more and more elitist control. Again, it was 5 attorneys, 2 of them who probably violated judicial ethics by overseeing and participating in a same-sex ceremony. And I think they should have not been allowed to rule on that if they had any ethics whatsoever. But what it will continue to promote is this thought amongst Kansans. It's very clear, but I hear this in districts all over this country. They think Washington's out of touch. Washington's not only out of touch, they're attempting to impose a elitist view. I think that this court, for example, spends more time worrying about what Western Europeans think than they do about Western Kansans, where I come from. I mean, they're going to be vacationing, most of them in Europe, and they sit in a bubble in Washington. We see that amongst the elected folks as well, and the bureaucrats as well. It's just a bubble, an elitist bubble that believes in bigger government. If you look around this town, it's perfect example of what happens when they take more and more money from the rest of Americans. Americans are struggling. The economy's flatlined, but not in Washington, D.C. The city continues to grow and grow. So you got this out of touch throughout Washington. There's, again, this ever-growing divide between the powers that be in Washington, D.C. and the rest of America. And that's my job as a conservative leader, is try to bridge that gap and make at least the folks that want to say they're conservative to understand that, hey, there's some issues out there we're not touching at all.
if XM reauthorization is attached to highway trust fund legislation, where does that leave conservatives in terms of voting for that bill?
Simple no. If you want to kill it, if you want to demonstrate once again that Washington Republicans are out of touch, just go ahead and do that. And there is an enormous debate. There are plenty of folks in the Republican Party that want to resurrect one program. Again, we have hundreds and hundreds of programs, and we've killed that. It's gone. The world didn't stop. It's still going on. The economy is still struggling, trying to move forward. And here we have hundreds and hundreds of programs. We killed one, and the Republicans madly working today, basically because of one interest, one company that gets the lion's share of the assistance from this because they've given tens and thousands of millions of dollars to lobbyists and campaign contributions. I mean, when people look at that and understand that this one company, which happens to be Boeing, has invested in their mind, they're spending more money trying to buy it and keep this bank alive than they are trying to do portions of the research and development. That's just where we have this whole system backwards. It's the perfect example. So I know I've had conservatives even in Washington say, well, you know, it's just one program. We can kill, what about the rest? But no, this is symbolism of what's the worst thing about Washington, where money buys access, campaign contributions buy access, and government policies buy market share. And we can't allow that to happen. So if Republican leaders, and the Speaker apparently wants to resurrect that, and we've got two leaders that don't, if they go that route, again, that just furthers this divide. It might be the final straw, where conservatives say, what difference does it make? And that's sometimes going home. It's a hard question for me to answer. What difference does it make what we think in Kansas, what conservatives think across America? But this is a center-right country. There's no way around that. So that's why every major presidential candidate right now that I know of is opposed to XM. And so we killed it. This is probably the biggest victory right now of the House Freedom Caucus, is we've allowed that to die. And this has been an inside-out strategy in which conservatives inside the Beltway and inside Congress and outside of Washington say, okay, this is something we need to take down. And we at least have done that temporarily. Hopefully it's a permanent end of the XM Bank.
Finally, I want to talk about sanctuary cities. Can Congress do something? And if so, what should they do?
Well, it's amazing. On one hand, the state of Arizona is not allowed to enforce the law. On the other hand, we let San Francisco and other cities not enforce the law, and we just have it backwards. I mean, there's a rampant problem in this country, indeed around the world, and actually the Holy Father talked about this lack of respect for the law. And if we are not ruled by laws, we are ruled by men, and the men and women can change, and they can change at will, at whim. So if there are certain laws that you say, hey, they can ignore that, I mean, that lessens all laws and makes them illegitimate and delegitimizes our entire government. So Congress can take away money from these cities. We can say, hey, if you're not going to follow what is clearly a national issue, immigration control of our borders, we can argue about many things in the Constitution, but that is a national defense issue. That is a national constitutional requirement. We protect our borders. But I think it's just shameful that we allow these to continue. But this has been going on a lot of time, and Republicans, we had a Republican president, perhaps allow these to happen. So we do have administration says just doesn't want to enforce the laws. They're punishing those that say, hey, we'll follow laws. And I see that in my home state of Kansas. Obviously in the middle and the heartland of it all, the geographical center of the district is right in the whole country is right in my district. And we see that as well, where you say, well, why worry about this law if they're going to ignore all these other laws? And so Congress can do that, but it is very difficult, I will admit, with those who are in the White House. But what we can do is use the power of the purse to hold this administration accountable, hold these cities accountable, and frankly, and these are generally Democrat cities, they get tons of money from Washington, D.C., and that should be a requirement, that if you want federal money, you probably should follow our federal laws dealing with border control and immigration.
All right, and I know I said that was going to be my final question, but I just thought about this. With all the policy areas that you mentioned, all the issues that need to be addressed, can anything be done to convince Speaker Boehner or House leadership to bring attention to these areas?
Well, what we saw last week or 2 weeks ago when they attempted to kick my colleague Mark Meadows off of his subcommittee chairmanship, that happened when it was temporary. They forced under pressure to let him keep that position. We still hear of acts of retribution been going on. I personally have been facing that for 2.5 years. But the difference now is conservatives in the House are much more organized through the House Freedom Caucus. We have an active Tea Party caucus that can engage folks outside of Washington. And it's a combination, and I think leadership is seeing that as well. But again, the real question is, how much more time do we have left? We're $18.5 trillion in debt, and we're sitting here still arguing only about one program. What about the hundreds of others that we borrow from the Chinese and other and Americans to fund and making our children and grandchildren pay it off? There's this urgency that I have and most conservatives have that frankly we're not seeing in Washington unless it's right around election time. So I think we continue to make a difference, and I think we see that in the fact that in the House, a large majority of us were elected after 2009, and so there's a young crop of folks still working it together. I think we see that in the growth of the House Freedom Caucus. We have, again, 50 members of the House Tea Party caucus and dozens of outside groups engaging and making a difference. But again, we have this establishment of a connection between the Democrats and a Republican establishment. Frankly, it's all status quo. You know, it is an us versus them. And I mean, Americans, I agree with them, and they feel frustrated. And so we need to call them to account. We need to call specifically, most important, Tea Party caucus and other groups. It's all about holding Republicans accountable who run the House and run the Senate and can do, frankly, anything we want to do. We can use reconciliation to put Obamacare on the table, repeal on the table of the president. And right now, the Senate Republicans apparently don't want to do what they promised to do 2 months ago. And that's what frustrates people. They understand trying and failing, but not trying at all. That is no longer an option.